Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tim Sandefur. I'm the Vice President for Legal Affairs here at the Goldwater Institute, and you're joining us for our conversation with Mark Skousen about his new book, The Greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, the World's Most Versatile Genius. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Skousen.
It's my first time here at the Goldwater Institute.
And now, Dr. Skousen, and for those who might not know, holds the Doty Spogel Chair in Free Enterprise at Chapman University, my own alma mater. I went to law school at Chapman University.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
And you're the former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, the producer still of Freedom Fest, the annual get-together. And you got your PhD in economics, right, from George Washington University.
Correct. Yeah.
So what got you interested in Benjamin Franklin?
Well, it's kind of interesting because it was an old family tradition on my mother's side that we were direct descendants of Benjamin Franklin through an illegitimate line, which does kind of fit in with the old
His
Franklin
reputation.
reputation. And so we always wanted, my wife and I went back to Philadelphia to try to confirm it because our family on my mother's side was from Pennsylvania, from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia areas. And so we did the genealogy and we discovered that there was in fact we were direct descendants of Franklin, and it was through the grandson of Benjamin Franklin had two illegitimate children that were called natural children. And the only reason we know about this is because it was in the will, that he put in the will, because the Franklin descendants kind of didn't want it known.
Sure.
Yeah.
So an actual descendant of Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then a couple of years ago, you published the completed autobiography of Benjamin Franklin.
Right. So this was something Franklin himself, he wrote the autobiography late in life, and he died before completing it. In fact, if you read the autobiography, which was required reading in all schools up until the 1920s, and you still find it in all the libraries, but Franklin got up to 1757 when he was 52 years of age, and he didn't finish the last 30 years of his life. So in the autobiography, there's nothing about the Revolution, about his 9 years in Paris as ambassador, the Constitutional Convention, all of this electric, important parts of his life. And so we went to Yale University that has the papers of Benjamin Franklin, and we pulled out from this. It's 50 volumes. So I went through 50 volumes, and we pulled out the autobiographical letters that he wrote, talking about his personal life and stuff. And we put it all together and created the completed autobiography, kind of volume 2.
Sure.
And it's all in Franklin's own words. And
right.
We did this in the 300th anniversary of Franklin's birth in 2006, published by Regnery. And it's 3 times bigger than the autobiography. Right. There's just so much material in there. And there were 2 quotes, by the way, that I pulled out from there that really surprised me, because Franklin's quoted a lot for a variety of reasons. Right. But the 2 are, a virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed. So what does that say about us? Do we have cheap government? Probably not. So maybe that says something about us. And the other one is, the system of America is commerce with all and war with none. Mm-hmm. Very idealistic. Both of them quite idealistic, but in some ways encapsulates his philosophy of life.
Yeah. Now your book is, and I'll hold it up again for those who are interested, The Greatest American. Your book is not a standard biography, really. You tell it more in a series of little vignettes. Like, for instance, here's a chapter on making enemies, and another chapter on traveling abroad, and so forth. What made you decide to write it in that style?
So it actually started out as a column for the Franklin Prosperity Report, published by Newsmax. And I did it for like 6 or 7 years, and every column had to be taking something that happened in Franklin's life or from his experience, and how would you apply it to today's situation, whether in business, investing, travel, friendship, enemies. What was his opinion of George Washington, of John Adams, of Thomas Jefferson? What is his views on diplomacy? How about fun? I have a chapter on fundraising for everybody who's into fundraising. The chapter that I have in the book on fundraising is quite eye-opening. So, and religion as well.
Right,
I had 80 chapters. They're short chapters, And what's fun about the book, so it's not a biography. It's not a, you're told things, people who have read this say, oh, I never knew that Franklin did this or that.
Right.
But what's fun about my book is you don't have to read it cover to cover. You can just jump around
Right.
whatever topic interests you.
Right.
And you can do that. And I will say that one of the columns was censored by Newsmax.
Really? Which one?
Well, it's chapter 77, and it's on the hard to govern passions of
Yeah.
Ben Franklin, about
Yeah.
sex and as a ladies' man. And he did have one illegitimate child,
Right.
William, and he was very close to William, and then they became bitter enemies because of the war.
Right. William remained a loyalist when the war broke out.
I know, and it was devastating because he actually actively engaged in raising arms against his father and his family, and Ben Franklin absolutely refused to forgive him for
Yeah.
that.
And
he
if I
held a
remember right,
grudge to the end of his life.
He was William was arrested and thrown in jail for 2 years by local patriots. And
Right,
Franklin
and then they
refused
did
to
an
interfere.
exchange of prisoners, and he ended up in England, and he was in England when Franklin was in Paris and going home, and he had a chance to meet. He did meet with William, but William wrote him a letter saying, let bygones be bygones, you know how the war is and stuff like that, let's be friends again. Franklin writes a letter back, which I quote in the book, and you can feel the emotion. He says, I can forgive you for a lot of things, but when you raised arms against me and went against my life, liberty, and my happiness and arms and so forth, this was inexcusable because their personal relationships are more important than political allegiances. And then he ends it and says, this is a disagreeable subject. I drop it. So you can feel that, right?
Well,
that
you know,
emotion.
it really brings home a point that the Ken Burns documentary that's going on right now about the American Revolution also makes this point, that the Revolution was a civil war as much as it was a war between two countries, and it tore families apart in many situations, including the lives of many of the founding fathers themselves.
Yeah, I mean, they were left desolate, many of them, and even slaves started working for. There's one section where the enslaved workers aligned with the British,
Yeah, right.
because the British were offering them freedom,
Right. Now,
not the colonists.
You mentioned earlier, you were talking about your column and Franklin's ideas about things, and particularly about economics. You have a section here where you, in your chapter on economics and the economy, where you say, I urge you to follow Franklin's sage advice, always spend less than you earn, and avoid going too heavily into debt. Now, most people, I think, would take that as being a common sense viewpoint, and that was, of course, Franklin's view. You explained that he put a lot of emphasis on saving and thrift, but that kind of sets him at odds with a lot of today's economists, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Much revenue. There's much revenue in economy, and no revenue is sufficient without it, Franklin said.
Yeah.
And Franklin was, he thought it was extremely important to be independent. You need to discharge your public debt. And of course, he was one who raised all of this debt to win the war.
Right.
When he was in France, he was borrowing all this money from the French. So I think he felt an obligation. And he was very supportive of Alexander Hamilton's ideas, even though he was near the end of his life when all this took place. But creating a national bond issue that Alexander Hamilton did, and then the sinking fund to pay it off, was all something that Franklin would be very supportive of. Franklin is not a libertarian in the sense that, a lot of libertarians are very critical of Alexander Hamilton and the national bank and the national debt and stuff like that. Franklin would be very supportive of Alexander Hamilton in that regard.
And opposed to Jefferson.
I argue, yes, and I argue in my book, and many historians say that Franklin is the most modern of the founders. So he would be, he was an advocate of paper money. Because the British actually passed a law prohibiting the colonists from making gold and silver coins. So what are you going to do? You have to use the British coins. Well, there was a huge shortage. So he said, he wrote a pamphlet in favor of printing of money. And he went to the legislature, and they passed the bill. And guess who got the job to print the money? So Franklin is he's a first for a lot of things, but he's also the first crony capitalist.
Yeah. Well, you meant the Parliament's prohibition on the colonists minting coins or making their own money was a very serious handicap to the colonial economies.
A lot of people think that was one of the major causes of the war, not just the tax issue, but also the fact that they were British were constantly meddling and keeping them from growing and expanding in their economy.
Yeah, it's sort of, if in many cases it forced colonists to resort to barter, or you would get into a situation where, in order to pay a tax bill, you'd have to auction your goods to raise the money to pay your tax bill, which was you might get 50% of their value. And this is at a time when you can go to jail for debt. So this is a very serious matter, and we tend to gloss over that when we talk about the American Revolution. And I think it's because the economic thing kind of goes over a lot of people's heads. But this had real life consequences for a lot of people.
By the way, Franklin was a defender of inflation. And he said at one point, he says, this is a glorious way to make sure everybody pays their fair share of taxes. Indirectly, with the depreciation of their currency, was his way of them saying, you're going to pay for the war whether you like it or not. You farmers out there that are constantly evading tax and protesting and stuff like that.
Well, you're right. Not exactly a libertarian by today's
standards. No. I think later in life he did. I mean, a virtuous, industrious people may be cheaply governed. And he was very much an advocate of the Adam Smith model of laissez-faire.
Yeah.
So I think later in life he said inflation too much is not good, that sort of thing. So I think he changed his mind a lot.
On the Adam Smith front, so you call Franklin the father of American capitalism, which is really a bold statement to make. Why do you think that Franklin was the father of American capitalism?
Well, he was certainly one of the most successful publishers as far as business is concerned. I mean, he was a great businessman. And he became so successful that he retired at the age of 42. And so, I mean, Jack Bogle wrote a book and said, listen, a Vanguard group of funds, he said, there's no question that Benjamin Franklin was kind of the first real capitalist who is American capitalism. He really embodied all of the virtues of industry, thrift, prudence, never declared bankruptcy. He did borrow money and stuff like that, but he handled things really well, really good business management. There have been books written about his business management skills.
And his knowledge of economics, how deep was his knowledge of economics? For example, did he know Adam Smith in person?
Yes. In fact, I have a whole chapter 29, I think it is, where I call Benjamin Franklin, Adam Smith's Invisible Hand. And so if you read The Wealth of Nations, there's a huge chunk about it on America. And it's very upbeat and optimistic. In fact, Adam Smith predicts that America will be one of the most formidable nations in the history of the world. And there's no question that that's Benjamin Franklin's influence. So the tradition is that Adam Smith would do chapter after chapter of his Wealth of Nations prior to 1776 and pass it around. He'd go down to the clubs and pass it around to various people, including Benjamin Franklin, and Benjamin Franklin would give advice. So there was that influence on the Wealth of Nations. At the same time, the Wealth of Nations influenced Benjamin Franklin because he advocated laissez-faire, stay away from us and stuff like that. But I would add one more thing about Benjamin Franklin being the ideal American businessman, because in today's world, again, Franklin, very modern, he did not just retire at age 42 and count his money and play golf all day. He was very much involved in civic activities, and his scientific experiments got started right after that on electricity. And so he became very much an advocate of practical inventions. I mean, if you can think of some of the inventions, maybe the people in the audience, I mean, the Franklin stove, bifocals.
Right. Although, if I remember the Disney cartoon right, it was that mouse that invented the bifocals.
positive left, positive, and the lightning rod,
Right.
extremely important. And they even say daylight savings time, but
Right.
that was kind of a story that he wrote in jest while he was in France.
Right.
So all of his stuff was very practical, very useful. I mean, it truly is the epitome, the acme of what American capitalism is all about.
And another virtue in that respect is he's really the first American self-made man story. In our literature, in our autobiographies, of course, I wrote a book some years ago about Frederick Douglass, which I titled Self-Made Man.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go back, I mean, Douglass was a self-made man, but he was leaning on this tradition, and the fountainhead of that tradition is Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, and the Horatio Alger type
Right.
stories, he was before Horatio Alger, but very much self-made from humble circumstances.
In some sense, he's an immigrant, right? Because he flees Massachusetts
Yeah,
because he
true.
can't get along with his brother as an apprentice.
Yeah, James, right.
And he moves to Pennsylvania. He arrives at Philadelphia with, $2 in his pocket and a loaf of bread under each arm.
Couple loaves of bread, yeah.
And he's basically a penniless immigrant arriving on the shores of Pennsylvania, and he has to kind of pull himself up by his own bootstraps.
Yeah, and of course he has the experience of being a printer.
Right.
And so he works for several different companies and then starts his own company. Actually goes to London for 2 years and was a printer there. So he had experience in London right away. He loved, by the way, London and Paris and the big cities.
Yeah.
He was not a fan of agricultural society in that respect. So he was really. I think the point we want to make is that he really emphasized honest work. And you'll notice in the autobiography there's a list of his 12 virtues.
Right.
And if you look at those virtues, they're all self-centered.
Yes, right.
They're all about, silence, industry, thrift, honesty, and so forth. But there's nothing in there on charity.
Right.
There's nothing on there on kindness.
Right. There's bourgeois virtues.
It's really quite shocking that he's so self-interested. The Ayn Rand people would really like that. But so he does these 12 virtues, and he goes up to a friend and he says, look at these 12 virtues that I'm trying to pursue. And the guy says, well, I see you left off one that's really important, because did you know this, that Dr. Franklin, everybody thinks you're vain. You're very arrogant. And so he adds humility on there. But again, I'm going to be humble.
Humility, imitate Jesus and Socrates.
Yeah, that's right. And one of my Chinese friends says, well, it should have been Confucius, because he had a Chinese gong, and he really liked, he actually published the writings of Confucius in the Pennsylvania Gazette.
That's interesting.
But again, Confucius is not listed there, so
right.
I don't think it was that much of an influence.
It's funny because he kind of resembles Buddha a little bit. But,
well, I have a friend of mine, Eric Wiener, who's written a book called Ben and Me, and he has a chapter that Franklin has a Buddhist philosophy. And of course, I said I had a big argument with him on that, because I said, well, what is Buddhism? What's the number one principle? Well, it's that life is suffering, right?
Yeah.
Well, Franklin would not have that negative view. He actually was upbeat, even though he had a number of ailments. He was always upbeat and optimistic. And the Buddhist philosophy is also one, well, how do you enjoy life? Well, you suppress your desires.
Right.
Well, that's not the Franklin view. You got a problem, you solve it by inventing something.
Yeah, it's really that entrepreneurial.
So it's very different. And we had Eric spoke at our Freedom Fest last year, and we had a wonderful debate on that
Well, now
subject.
it's funny because we talk about Franklin in these optimistic ways, and we tell these funny stories about him. And I think most people, when they think about Ben Franklin, they think about the pudgy, balding, grandfatherly type with the funny sayings, and thing. But he was really a radical. Let's see if I marked the page where you describe him. You say, suddenly Franklin becomes a radical, and that he should be given more credit for the radical Constitution of Pennsylvania of 1776. Tell us about Benjamin Franklin, the radical.
So he was very much a conservative for quite some time. He was a loyalist to the British Crown. He got his son William to be the governor of New Jersey. He loved the nightlife of London and everything. He was through and through a British citizen. And then his own experience in London and his run-ins on taxation and the Stamp Act, and as early like in 1772, so this is 4 years before the Declaration of Independence, he says, well, the evidence is pretty clear to me that we're destined to be separate. So right then he's starting to move away from there, and he was actually one of the earliest, and he actually helped fund and helped Tom Paine with Common Sense. A lot of people thought Benjamin Franklin actually wrote Common Sense because it was an anonymous pamphlet.
Right.
But he obviously denied it, and Thomas Paine is famous for it. But he helped him along to achieve that, and there's some great lines. I highly recommend the musical 1776. It's not totally accurate, but there's some parts there.
It's better than people give it credit for.
Yeah, it really is. Very accurate, I think, in terms of the attitudes of Franklin and Jefferson and Adams and so forth. Yeah.
Although Thomas Jefferson's wife was not blonde. I'm sorry. But no, it's true. 1776, I did a podcast a couple years ago with David Bowes of the Cato Institute.
Oh, you did?
He was a big fan of 1776, and so we did a
me too. And in fact, Howard De Silva performing as Benjamin Franklin is the best Benjamin Franklin I have ever seen, because he has that bon vivant spirit. He's upbeat, he's happy, he's smiling, he's dancing, he's a ladies' man.
Right.
The people that Michael Douglas and some of these other people who are Franklin, they're way too austere, they're way too serious.
Now, the Michael Douglas show, that's the Apple TV show that just came out, where it focuses on his life in France.
In France, yes.
As basically as a secret agent for the American government working in France, right? Mm-hmm. What did you think of that show?
Well, I thought it was miscast. Yeah. I hate to say it because there was so much hope that this would be good. And Michael Douglas used to be a ladies' man, but he got way too serious sobering and all these long dialogues. He was quite quiet. He was not, except with ladies and stuff like that, and that just didn't come out.
Franklin in France, he really did have to sort of toe a fine line there, because he's trying to recruit France to support the American cause, but of course he can't, irritate the absolute monarch of France, which would be, a bad thing. So he has this reputation for being a very skillful diplomat in a way that John Adams, who went to be in Europe with him, definitely was not. Tell us about Franklin and John Adams. Yeah,
this is kind of a sad part of the diplomacy that was going on there, because Benjamin Franklin was 70 years old when he was sent over in 1776. So that's pretty old.
Yeah,
he's getting up there in age.
He's a lot older than a lot of the other American revolutionaries.
So they send these other commissioners, 4 or 5 other commissioners, including John Adams, and Abigail, his wife, comes with them and stuff like that, to check on making sure that Ben Franklin's doing it. And he's a cause célèbre. When he arrives, people just swamp because of his scientific contributions.
Right.
The French love this guy. It's like winning the Nobel Prize.
Right.
And so he's very popular, and he has no free time of himself. And the French love him, and he loves the French because they're so social. Mm-hmm. And he goes to these salons that are run by women, like Madame Havasus and Madame Brionne and so forth. And he just gets along with them so well. He's so good in diplomacy. I have this in my chapter on fundraising, that he raises all the money. Nobody else does this. Not the Lee brothers, not Ralph Echard. Can you imagine a diplomat by the name of Ralph Echard? It's not going to go over well, and he hated the French. John Adams hated the French, because they were Puritans, and they didn't understand the sociality, the sexual combustibility, the flirting and stuff like that. They didn't get it at all, but Benjamin Franklin did. And I'll tell you an interesting story. So Franklin raised all this money, the armaments. He sent 2 generals, a German general and Lafayette, over to help win the war. Franklin is the grandfather of our country in the sense that George Washington won the war at home.
Right.
Franklin won the war abroad, no question about it. And there's this one scene where Franklin has raised all the money, and I mean, it's just, he's tired of it. He's sick and tired of raising money. And the Congress sends him a note saying, we need another 25 million livre. Can you please raise another 25 million livre? Franklin writes back and says, no, I've reached my limit. They've reached the limit. We can't do this anymore. Say, oh, we've got to have you. So Franklin finally relents, and in his best diplomatic, left-handed, writes this wonderful letter to Vergennes, the French minister, and says, listen, we need 25 million livres, and you've got to do this, because if you don't, the British will control the world for the next 100 years, and France will be a loser, we'll be a loser. So he sends off this letter. Here's absolutely nothing for a week. Sends another letter saying, what's going on? Finally, Vergennes writes and says, come to Versailles and we shall meet. So gets in his carriage, Franklin gets in his carriage and gets there right away, walks in, and Vergennes is just very serious, somber, looking at Franklin. He says, Dr. Franklin, we know that you're broke. We know that not only will you not be able to pay back the principal, you can't even pay the interest on the debt. But you know what? We're also broke. We don't have any money we just have no money left after all of the things that are going on in this world. So I'm sorry, Dr. Franklin, we cannot loan you your 25 million or what, 25 million livres. And then he paused, and then he said, but because of the love you have for the French people, and because of the love the King of France has for you, he is taking 6 million livres out of his pocket as a free gift to you, the American people. Right. Now, Tim, this is what we call fundraising.
Yeah, seriously. Now, that would never have happened for John Adams.
My chapter on fundraising has that story in there. Oh, my God.
It's hard to imagine somebody feeling that way about John Adams. Yeah.
But John Adams never raised any money.
Right.
Except in Denmark or the Dutch, he finally raised some money, but that was after the war was over.
Yeah, right.
So they did not get along at all.
What did you think of the HBO miniseries about John Adams and its depiction of Franklin?
Well, I think it was, the John Adams was excellent, all right? But again, I can't remember the name of the character but it didn't look like Franklin. Howard De Silva is the guy who looks like Franklin, acts like Franklin.
Right.
There's been nobody better.
Right. There's that famous story about the two of them having to share a room together.
Oh, yeah.
And Adams wants to close the window, and Franklin has this idea that the night air is good for you.
In fact, he would sleep he would be naked.
Yeah.
And he would walk around in the morning naked and open up the windows and have the cool air in there. He thought that was really good for your health.
Right.
Adams was totally against it. Yeah, that's true.
Now, on here, you've got a section here where you quote something that Franklin says. He says, Franklin says, I have always thought that one man of tolerable abilities may work great changes and accomplish great affairs among mankind. So you've just given us a good example. Can you think of another tells us another story of how Franklin by himself, as a man of tolerable abilities, had worked great changes?
Well, certainly in the Constitutional Convention, that was really important. So it comes near the end, and they have this conflict on representation in the House and the Senate. Are you going to represent the people, or are you going to represent the states? Mm-hmm. And they were not willing to compromise. They were fighting. So Ben Franklin gets up and says, well, why don't we pray? Let's have prayers. We used to have prayers in the Constitutional Convention, and we haven't had them. And then he goes into this talk about the longer I live, the more I know that God governs in the affairs of men, and have we not seen God intervene so that we would win this war? And I mean, it's a very powerful statement of his religious transformation, in a sense, because he used to be a deist and a skeptic. Well, he never was a churchgoer particularly. But here he is exclaiming that God does intervene. He's an active theist. Mm-hmm. He's changed his mind on religion. And he suggests this compromise, which is now called the Connecticut Compromise in the Constitution, where the House represents the people and the Senate represents the states. And he worked to make that happen. So he talked about how in woodworking you cut part of this board and this board so that it fits properly.
Right.
And that was his comparison. And by the way, they never did have prayers in the Constitution because they couldn't pay the minister. They didn't have any money. But Franklin
should have just printed them some.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Now, well, tell us about Franklin's religious views, because I think he does have this reputation for being a real skeptic, but you say he went through phases?
Yeah, and one thing that Franklin was very good in his civic duties, he was very much involved with the churches, so he was actually giving money to synagogues, to various church organizations. He was very much a friend with George Whitefield, the Methodist minister who had such a powerful voice. In the autobiography, Franklin describes how he listened to George Whitefield, and he'd go back one street at a time. He could go back 10 streets, 10 blocks, and hear George Whitefield projecting. So he estimated 20,000 people could listen to George Whitefield at a particular time.
Amazing.
Well, Whitefield said, come to church. And Franklin says, well, I don't normally come to church. I have my own liturgy and my own study on Sunday. I don't go to church. Well, you need to come to my church because I'm trying to raise money for this this orphanage in South Carolina. He said, well, how about an orphanage here? Franklin was always arguing with him. But he goes reluctantly to hear him, and he said, but when I entered the church, I was determined not to give him any of my money. I had made that vow. So Whitefield is speaking for a while, and finally he softens Franklin's heart, and he says, well, I'll give him the coppers in my pocket. 5 more minutes later, he says, oh, well, I guess I ought to give him the silver. And finally, at the end of his sermon, he is so moved, he said, I'm going to give him everything, my gold, my silver, my copper. He just throws it all in
finally
there.
found a fundraiser even better than himself, I guess. That's funny.
But he was, his religious views, again, John and Abigail Adams saw him as a heretic and a non-believer. He's going to hell because he's not going to church, and I'm not sure he was even baptized. Maybe he was, because they often had baptism when you're 2 or 3 days old. That could have been the case, but he was definitely in that skeptical mode. Now, he was a Mason. He was a grand Mason, and he was very active in the Masonic lodges, both in Boston, in Philadelphia, and not in Boston, but in Philadelphia and in Paris.
Right.
And he met Voltaire there, and there's a lot of really interesting things that he was involved with. But at the end of his life, a Yale minister asked him, "Well, what are your religious views?" And he basically said, "Well, if I'm a firm believer in the Christian virtues of charity and honesty and keeping the 10 Commandments and that sort of thing. And I believe that God is just, and I do believe in God and so forth." But he says, as to whether Jesus is our Messiah, that I still have my doubts, but I'm about to find out, and I don't need there's too much time and effort to put this together. I'm just going to wait until I die, and then I'll find out.
Right.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
Interestingly, he left, if I remember right, left in his will a request that he be buried in Quaker burying ground if they would allow that.
Well, it was the Church of Christ that he was actually buried in, even today, right next to his wife.
Because the Quakers said no.
Oh, well, maybe that was the reason, yeah. But,
which is quite surprising, although it's surprising that he would make the request, except that you can kind of see why a lot of Quakerism might appeal to him. It's very individualistic and things. But, of course, obviously the pacifism, he would not have gone along with pacifism.
No, I don't think so, although he did work with the Quakers on Indian issues and stuff like that.
Right.
But I will mention that at the end of his, throughout his life, he wrote this epitaph that you may have heard of, the body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not wholly be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author.
Yeah, it's
now
brilliant.
that's a belief in resurrection.
Yeah, it's beautifully
He
written.
believed in God. He believed in the next life. He just didn't fit into any particular denomination. He was
Now,
kind of open.
one reason I suspect that the Quakers attracted him is because of slavery, because they were, of course, the most outspoken anti-slavery group in America in his lifetime. Tell us about Benjamin Franklin and
Yeah,
slavery.
so I have a chapter on his attitude toward minorities, and it's blacks, it's the Indians, Native Americans, and also women. Those three areas, I have chapters on each one of them. And what's interesting is he did own slaves, but they were more servants. They weren't in the fields
Right.
or anything.
And that was kind of early in his life.
It wasn't
right?
like Jefferson.
Right.
No, well, actually, when he went to London as an agent, he
Yeah.
took 2 slaves with him as
Yeah.
slaves, Peter and I can't remember the other one, but but they were servants and they had a lot of freedom and stuff like that. But still, I mean, they were slaves, no question about that. And he helped fund the Negro school of Philadelphia, and he and I think one of the ministers went there and visited the school, and Franklin describes how he was shocked to learn that the black students were just as smart and as alert as the white students.
This brings to mind, there's the Socratic dialogue where Socrates teaches the geometrical proof to the slave boy and uses this as proof that anybody can learn.
Oh, yeah. And so he learned that. And at the end of his life, Franklin became the first president of the Society to Abolish Slavery in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And he introduced one of the first legislation in Congress to abolish slavery. And of course, it was tabled and nothing happened.
And the Philadelphia Society, the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society, was also the first anti-slavery society in the world.
So I didn't know that. Well,
this is taking a lead in the very vanguard of anti-slavery viewpoints.
Yeah, and really he was ahead of his time in that regard, in that respect. I mean, you look at modern 20th century, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, they were racist. They were very discriminatory in their attitudes. Franklin seemed to be much more, I mean, he had his biases and stuff like that. I'm sure he still had some prejudices. He took the sides of Native Americans. He thought the Indians were mistreated by the whites in many cases. There's some quotes on that. And he actually negotiated an agreement for the Paxson boys who went and butchered a bunch of the Indian tribes and stuff like that. That was a major issue where he had to work with the Penn, Governor Penn, and those people who hated Franklin, but they got together to resolve this particular issue.
Yeah.
And then finally on women, Franklin was very much, did not believe that women were just sexual objects. He saw them as real intellects. There are some wonderful letters between him and Madame Brionne about philosophy and his personal opera that they would have, and Madame Helvétius.
His personal opera?
Yeah.
Tell us about his personal opera.
Well, he says, I never get a chance to go to the opera, so you're my opera. These were talented women that he really appreciated their abilities and not just their beauty. So, yes, he was considered a lecher by many of his
But
critics.
that's kind of overstated, right? I mean, he wasn't he flirted a lot, but the idea that he was actually a Lothario is a bit exaggerated, right?
Well, yeah, and as one of the historians says, he was a bit too old to be a philanderer and stuff like that. However, there is some evidence that there's this big debate about did he abandon his wife Deborah to go to London to be this agent, gone for 8 or 10 years, and then gets back for 2 years, then leaves again. She dies alone, and he's still in London, doesn't come back for the funeral. So a lot of historians criticize Franklin for abandoning his wife. But one thing you have to understand, and this comes out in my completed autobiography, that Franklin, there's a lot to suggest that Deborah abandoned him.
Oh, really?
Because she actually was adamantly refused to go with him. She had this really deep hatred or fear of going on the oceans, kind of like people are afraid of flying.
Sure.
And she absolutely adamantly refused to go with him. So he ended up going alone. Now, it is true that socially they were very different because she was more of a homebody. She was more interested in pedestrian type affairs. She was not interested in philosophy and economics and diplomacy and stuff like that. She was a homebody. And Franklin was very different. So he goes over and the house that he stays in is taken care of by Mrs. Stevenson, who has a daughter. And it's pretty clear that they developed some kind of a friendship. There's actually a drawing by a painter in London where he's kissing a young woman. So there is some element of maybe he wasn't as faithful as we thought. He was still a virile man when he was a London official and stuff like that. But there's evidence of only one illegitimate child. The reason there is this tradition of illegitimacy is because Franklin's son William had an illegitimate child, and that child had an illegitimate child. And of course, if you look at my descendants from Benjamin Franklin, there's another illegitimate child in there. So it seemed to be kind of running in the family. But he wasn't just constantly having illegitimate children everywhere. There's only one that we're aware of.
Right. Now, we've talked about comparing Franklin with Adams, and we've talked about comparing Franklin with Hamilton, but let's compare Franklin with Jefferson.
Yes, so they were really close. They were very good friends. And in fact, Jefferson took his place as ambassador to France. And they worked together.
In fact, if I remember right, the famous line is somebody in France said to him, well, you're taking Dr. Franklin's place. And Jefferson said, nobody could ever take Dr. Franklin's place. I'm merely succeeding him in office.
Yes, that's correct. That is a famous line. And Jefferson actually, when he returned right before Franklin passed away, he visited with him. And it was a very touching scene as they reminisced and so forth. But in the two ways, Franklin and Jefferson were opposite poles. One is Jefferson loved he thought the agrarian society was the ideal society.
Right.
Franklin loved the big cities. He didn't really like the agrarian society. So he loved London. He loved Paris. He thought Philadelphia is fine, but it's still a small town. He liked the big cities, and he liked the social and all of the wonderful debates and the clubs. He was a clubber and so forth. And the second one is Jefferson hated paper money. He only wanted gold and silver. He hated the central bank, all of this stuff. He didn't like Hamilton's central bank things and all this sort of thing. Hated inflation. Franklin was pro-inflation, pro-paper money, not a big fan of gold and silver, and loved the central banks and liked what Hamilton was doing. He was an investor in the Bank of Pennsylvania and Bank of New York and so forth. He was very modern. Franklin was very modern compared to the other founders. I mean, Jefferson would have trouble in today's society of paper money and big cities and stuff like that. That would not be his
We've all bought
style.
into Hamilton's scheme.
Yes, but you
As a Jeffersonian myself.
Yeah, I was going to say you're a Jeffersonian. So, in what sense are you a Jeffersonian?
Well,
the laissez-faire, limited government.
Yeah, the way I see it is Jefferson gets, I think, an unfair shake as being. People don't give him enough credit for being an advocate of laissez-faire. As much as he was. And one thing that really gets overlooked is that Jefferson, among all the founding fathers, Jefferson is the one who is most outspoken about the colony's right to free trade with all the world. This is something he shares with Franklin. Franklin
yes,
is also
absolutely. Yeah.
And in fact, when you mentioned earlier about Adam Smith, not only are there these optimistic passages in Wealth of Nations about the future of America, but there's also some dark passages about America, or rather about the Navigation Acts, the Hat and Felt Act, the Iron Act, and other British parliamentary legislation that restricts trade between the colonies and between the colonies and the mother country. And Jefferson was just always emphatic that we have a right to free trade with all the world. And most of the revolutionaries early on did not go that far. They would say the Parliament has no right to tax us, but they can regulate our commerce. And Jefferson was the one saying, no, they don't even have the right to regulate our commerce. Early on, that's made him more radical than a lot of other people.
Right, and that's an area where Ben Franklin would be in total agreement. In fact, there's several quotes where no nation was ever ruined by trade, even the most disadvantageous. So the idea that Trump is saying that we're being ripped off by foreigners and stuff like that.
Right.
Well, no. Because as consumers, I mean, you go to Target, you go to Walmart, and so on. I mean, these goods are cheap because of globalization and free trade, and we are the greatest free trade nation in the world. We had tariffs of 2 to 3% until the recent unpleasantness, and so that was the case. But Franklin was a big fan of free trade and laissez-faire in general.
Well, this was on my list of questions I wanted to ask you. So about tariffs and Franklin's attitude, because today the argument for tariffs is often, well, we need to protect American industry so that we can build up our domestic manufacturing capacities in case something goes wrong internationally so we can make things at home. What do you think Franklin would have thought of that?
I couldn't find any quotes to defend that infant industry argument that was made later on. And of course, the main source of income after when the United States got started were tariffs.
Right.
And the sinking fund came from income from tariffs as well as taxes on liquor and stuff like that.
Right.
And they actually paid off the debt by 1820.
Yeah.
So Franklin was very much an advocate of discharging the public debt. He wanted us to be independent,
right,
by discharging the public debt,
as opposed to, say, Alexander Hamilton. So to me the distinction between Jefferson and Hamilton is that Jefferson he does believe in every independent small farmer, like owning your plot of land, and you don't answer to anybody else, and you raise your own food, and people leave you alone, and that's that's kind of his ideal.
Yeah.
Whereas the Hamiltonian ideal is that we're all somehow yoked together into this national enterprise, and part of the national bank scheme was to use that era's version of income taxes to generate revenue that then the government would channel to those industries that it considered worthwhile. So it's kind of, the first stirrings of national economic planning going on in Hamilton's report on manufactures.
Yeah, I don't think Franklin would support that particular. He did recognize the need for tariffs as revenue, just to pay off the national debt. I think Franklin would support that. But as a nationalistic type of thing, he has quite a few on a liberal immigration policy. He said, we invite everyone to come to America, but it's not who you are, it's what can you do.
Yes. And there's another passage, I remember, one of my favorites, where he's talking about myths about America. He wrote this newspaper article, about what immigrants think of America. And he said, people think that the turkeys will fall from the sky onto your plate and that the roofs are all shingled in pancakes. But the reality is that you have to come here and make it on your own by your own hard work.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was a big defender of commercial society and speculation and finance. This was very rare back in those days, and even Jefferson and others who were suspicious of the speculative fevers and stuff like that. And Franklin was very much a part of that. And franchising his business and a lot of the things, merger acquisitions kind of things that were going on. There's been a whole book called The Political Philosophy. By the way, I was coming up with a list of all the things that Franklin would be in a top list.
Yeah.
There's a book called The 100 Political Philosophers, and they've got Franklin in there.
Yeah.
And for his defense of commercial society and speculation and that sort of thing, which was very rare among philosophers.
Yeah.
And he's also really in the top 100 wealthiest Americans.
Right. And on that, actually, I wanted to ask you about that, because you have a chapter called In Defense of the Rich.
Yeah.
And, today there's this slogan that goes around every now and then, we don't need billionaires, and there's no excuse for the existence of billionaires. But you think Franklin would have rejected that attitude? No, he was very much in favor of wealth accumulation and to use wealth for good purposes. So he's very much in the Warren Buffett
Bill Gates, you know, the giving away of money for charitable and civic duties and that sort of thing. He's not an Ayn Rand type of person in the sense of I'm just keeping it all to myself and to my family. And it's amazing how many people you meet who. I meet a lot of people because I write an investment newsletter. So I go to conferences and I meet with people and so forth. And there's a lot of people saying, no, I'm not giving any money to charity. Charity is a waste of money. I'm not going to give money to, I'll give it to my family and that's it. You know, and that's very much contrary. Franklin did say, near the end of his life, he said, the years come and go and the last will finally come. And I'm hoping at that point I will be known as someone who lived a useful life and didn't just die rich.
Yeah, right.
So he does have an attitude of using riches for good purposes.
Sure.
No question about that.
You know, I had a recent experience. I went to Chicago a couple of years ago. I had never been there before, and so a couple of years ago we went and looking around at the cool old buildings from the 19th century, you know, the Louis Sullivan buildings and all this sort of thing, and I was really struck by what pride they took in their cities in the late 19th century, especially in America. The idea of city fathers was a really big idea. The wealthy business owners in the community took pride in their cities and did their best to build it up and have civic institutions, you know, museums and all these other things in their communities. And it seems like Franklin is like the godfather of this attitude. He's the bourgeois values coming to America. Really.
I mean, you look at all the things he was involved with, civic authority and starting the first public library, the first university of Pennsylvania. It wasn't called that at first. It was an academy or something like that. First postmaster general, paving of roads, lighting, first hospital. In fact, I have in my chapter on fundraising, he did the matching funds. He went to the legislature and he said, listen, we need a hospital. We don't have a hospital in Philadelphia. Let's and can you fund it? No. And I said, so Franklin says, I'll tell you what, if I can raise privately 2,000 pounds, will you kick in 2,000 pounds? Oh, yeah, Franklin, sure. Yeah, go right ahead. See if you can raise 2,000 pounds. There's no way you're going to do that. But he raised the money, and so the legislature gave the two, and that's where the matching funds comes from.
Amazing.
But again, Philadelphia had the first hospital.
Right.
And, that kind of civic duty is lost a lot. And he did run for office, and he was a legislator. He was a clerk. He did a lot of things with the Pennsylvania legislature. He won elections. He lost elections. The reason he went to London as a colonial agent for Philadelphia or for Pennsylvania is because he lost an election in the legislature. So he was so active as a public figure.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Truly amazing.
It really is incredible.
And then his scientific contribution. He was America's first scientific American. There's a whole book written called America's First Scientific, or the First Scientific American, and that's Ben Franklin.
I remember years ago I was listening to a lecture by the famous physicist Richard Feynman.
Oh, yeah.
And he's describing some phenomenon, and he's talking extemporaneously. And I remember he says, was that Faraday or was that Franklin? And I thought, wow, how amazing is it that Benjamin Franklin is still being referred to, not just for historical purposes, but for their scientific theories, by this famous 20th century physicist, as not in terms of just celebrating him as but the actual content of his scientific ideas. It's incredible.
And so,
not bad for a guy with no education. I mean, Ben Franklin had no education to speak of. He went to Latin school for a year or two. I think.
Very little education.
And everybody called him doctor.
But he loved to read. He was self-reading for a very early age by candlelight. The old story of candlelight. And he read everything. He was interested in all. He had a liberal arts education, but it was self-taught.
Right.
And then when it came to the scientific contributions, he was enamored with the British who came over with these electric experiments and the shock. You'd shock people and entertain them and stuff like that. but he always wanted to see, what about electricity? What about the lightning? Is that electricity?
Right.
And he did the experiment to find that out, and then wrote it up years later. And he got the Copley Prize, which was kind of the Nobel Prize at the time, and that's how he became very famous. And a lot of people say, they argue that his scientific contributions is what led to his political contributions.
Oh, I'm sure of that. Yeah.
And he wouldn't have been ambassador and stuff like that.
Now, we only got like a couple minutes left, so I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you my final question, which is, how has knowing Franklin improved your life?
How has Franklin improved my life? Well, I do think that, especially Franklin being a skeptic about religion, I've told this, I said, for many scientists who are agnostic or atheists, I had this discussion just a couple days ago, he's the ideal, and is somebody to really look up for. This is why I called him the greatest American. Is because, and I'm not the only one who has said this,
Sure.
because other historians have said he's the greatest American. I mean, Ken Burns said he was the greatest American diplomat. But you go beyond that to, here's a man who was self-taught, and so I've always been always reading, liberal arts education. I think I was drawn into that from the Franklin experience and background, and his being a direct descendant, and going from skepticism and deisposition to change his mind. The idea of changing your mind. He went from being
It's a very
loyalist,
Franklin idea by itself, isn't it?
Yeah, going from a loyalist to being a radical,
Right.
from a conservative to somewhat libertarian in that respect. A skeptic in religion to somebody who is a believer of sorts. All through his life, he's making changes and stuff like
Right.
that. And how many of us are just stubborn and we just stay with what we believe in, and no matter what?
Right.
So to me, I look up to Franklin as somebody who I could learn from and do really well.
Right.
But there he did and also I have done a quote book. So, Poor Richard's Almanac was this extremely popular almanac, and what helped him become a millionaire, because others had done almanacs, but he done. And so I have this book called The Maxims of Wall Street, and it's all these great quotes. And, of course, Warren Buffett and Jesse Livermore quoted more than anyone else, but the third person quoted the most is Ben Franklin.
Right.
And he has so many quotes, and he's misquoted also. I have a chapter on that too.
Well, we'll have to do a whole hour on just the Benjamin Franklin misquotes at some point. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Skousen. Mark Skousen's book, The Greatest American, Benjamin Franklin, the World's Most Versatile Genius, and your other books on Franklin. Thank you so much for joining us and for teaching the world about this fascinating American.
Thank you, Tim. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Goldwater Institute. This is great.